Endtroducing is quite possibly one of the most unique albums ever created. From its use of samples to the atmosphere each song exhibits, there's no wonder why it's so good. So, what is Endtroducing? Who made such an album? And above all, how was an album released nearly 30 years ago still considered one of the greatest ever made? The year is 1994, and a 22-year-old named Joshua Davis had just started to produce his first album. Located in his apartment in Davis, California, he'd utilized three pieces of equipment, those being the legendary Akai MPC-60, which was primarily used for sampling, as well as two others, being a Technics SL-1200 for spinning records, and an Alesis digital audio tape recorder for recording. These three would all have a massive impact on any future songs he'd make, especially the MPC-60, which at the time was a revolutionary music station, allowing artists to sample up to 13 seconds of a song. This was incredibly important, as it was just enough to give artists freedom to experiment with longer samples, but it was also limited enough where it forced them to get creative. This limitation would help Davis become experimental, as he had to be more selective on what he could sample. Although, it wasn't the only deciding factor to his creativity. A relatively big record store named Rare Records, which was located in Sacramento, California, was a mere 20 minutes away from Davis's home, and this record store had a ground floor as well as a basement. This is important to note, as the top floor mostly contained well-known records, while the basement carried many more unknown records. This was a big deal. If anyone couldn't find what they were looking for, the store's owner, Orrin Ed Hartman, would look in the basement and usually find what the person wanted. However, this begs a question. How come Hartman was the one to look for the records, and not the person who requested them? Well, it has to do with the fact that this section of the building was sealed off from the general public. At least, it was sealed off for most. In 1993, a customer who was looking for posters in the basement spotted something off in the distance. Something that almost looked too shocking to be real. It was a ghost of what appeared to be a 90-year-old woman wearing Victorian-era clothing, telling the customer to leave because they were making too much noise. As a result of this, and Hartman occasionally flaunting with customers by telling them how big the area was, it resulted in the basement becoming an almost urban legend among locals. Very few were allowed in the basement, and to get access to it was incredibly difficult. Despite being one of the most consistent customers, it took Davis 5 years of collecting records from the store before he was even given a chance to look down there. In his own words, he'd say, "I remember him saying, 'Well, if you think this is a lot of records, the whole basement is filled, and it's even bigger than the top floor up here.' Me and my friend that I used to go around buying records with at that time, we both thought he was basically just bullshitting us. Then one time he said, 'Well, we've got 5 minutes till close. Why don't you go down the stairs and have a look?' It was just one of those moments where it was like, holy fuck, this is insane." So, what about this basement was so insane to Davis and his friend? Well, it has to do with the fact that it contained one of the largest untouched record collections in the world. There were so many records that they piled up to the ceiling. To put it bluntly, it was a record-digging paradise. Anything that you wanted to sample was there. All it took was patience, creativity, and knowing what to look for. Davis already knew he wanted to make an instrumental hip-hop album entirely out of samples, but to find records that would fit for what he was going for was a bit more difficult. In a 2012 interview with NPR, he was asked,
"Where would you find these records? You just pick them up at a record store. They were, maybe 50 cents or 75 cents, and just buy them and just on a whim and see if they work?"
Sure, in some cases, but in other cases, you start to develop kind of a sense of things that are going to make it, increase the odds of having something fruitful within the grooves. You start looking for certain labels, you start looking for certain producers. One of the first things that I realized is that anything prior to 1966 probably wasn't going to have what I was looking for, because once James Brown invented funk, then music began to settle into kind of a 4/4 groove, which is what hip-hop is based on.
With this knowledge in mind, as well as the sheer magnitude of records and the lack of distractions from others, he was able to spend hours every day digging through records that some had forgotten or never heard of. In fact, during a 2001 documentary named Scratch, Davis would state,
"Just being in here is a humbling experience to me, because you're looking through all these records and it's sort of like a big pile of broken dreams in a way. Almost none of these artists still have a career, really. So you have to kind of respect that in a way."
And he isn't wrong. A lot of these artists faded out of the music world, whether it be because their music just didn't live up to the standards of others, or simply due to bad luck. In a lot of ways, it's overwhelming looking at crates or piles of records stacked onto each other, especially knowing you could be the last person to set your eyes on one. However, what most might consider trash is another man's treasure. These records were perfect for sampling, not only because they were unheard of, but also because of the unique yet simple music they brought. This explains why Davis dug through so many records each day, and it wasn't uncommon for him to have piles of records he'd bring home. Matter of fact, in 1995, Davis would shoot home footage during the middle of Endtroducing's production, and the amount of records he collected is absurd. Now, not every record was perfect. A good chunk of them were never used, and if they were, the chances of them being made into a beat was significantly lower. This is yet again apparent in his home footage, where he showcases a beat he created with his MPC 60.
It'll be coming out of there momentarily, so peep it out. It's fat. It's definitely fat. Okay. What now?
Whether this beat was put on a shelf or just outright scrapped is unknown, but it does give us an inside view of his creative process. Most of the stuff he made was not album worthy to him, and if it was, it sure as hell was not going to be his first one. His debut album wasn't going to be just fat beats. Instead, it was going to be an art, something for people to study. Through the years of non-stop record digging and working with samples, he finally had his album finished. On September 16th, 1996, Davis, under the name DJ Shadow, would release his debut album named Endtroducing. And within days of the release, it was a hit. When the album was initially released in the United Kingdom, it garnered solid success within the country, eventually being listed as a top 20 album on the UK Albums Chart for 1996, a very impressive number for a debut album. And part of the reason why this album was as successful as it was in the UK was due to the fact Davis had already established himself in the country in the early 90s, which also explains why the album was initially released in the country. However, while the initial success was solid, to get it known in a bigger market, such as the United States, was a bit more difficult. So, knowing this fact, Davis would attempt to take advantage of promoting his work, mainly through the media, such as interviews. This was a good idea, as when he'd come back to the US, he'd be able to release his album and have, at the very least, decent success. So, upon returning to the States, he'd issue his album on November 19th, 1996, and the reaction to the album was thoroughly disappointing. Despite receiving praise from the UK, the opposite happened in the US. It almost seemed like no one cared or even knew about his album. To him, he felt like he was robbed. This mix of harsh feelings made him feel isolated, and in an interview with Zane Lowe, he further describes how he felt.
So I'm back home in my little, $700 a month flat, like 1-bedroom flat or whatever, in quiet little Davis, California, just kind of feeling like, wow, what just happened? And what I found was that I was angry. I felt really angry about so much that I had learned. I mean, I had looked behind the curtain of the music industry. I was good friends with the guy who ran A&M Records, which had taken on Mowax in the UK, a guy named Osman. And he revealed things to me about the way that stuff works. And I thought I was ready for it. And in some cases, I don't think I was. And I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I didn't feel anything other than, wow, I worked really hard on this, put everything I had into it. I have no idea. And nobody around here knows it exists. So it didn't feel real. And for some reason, my response was anger.
Not only was Davis upset that he got minimal attention despite putting his heart and soul into his art piece, but he felt like he was being deceived by the press, including the record label which helped him release the album. As a result of this, it made him feel like he had barely any control over his life. So, as a way of coping, he would instantly go back to making music, eventually creating a single known as High Noon, arguably one of Davis's most intense and emotional songs. Fortunately, this despair would slowly end. As the end of '96 occurred, his album would slowly gain more success in the US as well as the UK, and by the start of '97, the album gained critical acclaim. Many music journalists would write about the album, one of them being David Bennon, which would state, "I am totally confounded by it. I hear a lot of good records, but very few impossible ones. You need this record. You are incomplete without it." Within months, the album went from making a small dent in the UK to becoming one of the most well-known albums of the decade. And it wasn't just the music market that was affected by it, it was other markets too. Legendary skateboarder, as well as 1998 Skater of the Year, named Andrew Reynolds, would release his part for the 1998 skate video titled The End as a part for the skate company named Birdhouse. And as a final song in his part, he'd use an extended version of DJ Shadow's song named Organ Donor, which was a part of the album. Not only did Reynolds' groundbreaking part help himself become more known, but his unique music taste unintentionally helped out Shadow too, as a rising scene of skateboarders heard his music. So, how did Davis make the samples work in such a profound way that allowed his album to become iconic? Well, if we take a look at Shadow's most famous song on Endtroducing, named Midnight in a Perfect World, we can see the beauty of his sampling. In total, he'd use 8 songs, the first of which was a 4-second sample taken from Organized Confusion's Releasing Hypnotical Gases.
Sodium, chloride, insight, foresight, more sight. The clock on the wall reads midnight. You feel nauseous.
And by using a sliding stretch to slowly lower the pitch of the sample, as well as using some subtle reverb, we can get an identical tone to Shadow's.
Insight, foresight, more sight. The clock on the wall reads midnight.
However, this is just the start. Another 6-second sample, named The Madness Subsides by Pekka Paholia, would be used as an intro transition. Now that the main riff was discovered, Shadow would use a 9-second sample from Meredith Monk's song titled Dolman Music, is a way to slowly transition into the drum break. As for the drums, he would take a 3-second drum break from Rotary Connections' Life Could. However, instead of leaving the drum break as it is, he would slow and pitch the drums, as well as chop them, allowing him to customize the arrangement of the drums. This gives the song a more monotone, relaxed vibe. And to help with this fact, Shadow would use 2 more samples. The first being Sour of Seeds by Baraka, in which he would sample the first 40 seconds of the song.
You came to the corner of my heart.
At first, the singing may seem out of place, but once paired with all the other samples, you now have a nearly perfect night song. Now, how DJ Shadow was able to make this sample longer than a 13-second limitation on the MPC 60 is quite confusing. While doing research for this video, I looked closely at Shadow's home footage and found that he was using the MPC 62, which allows an artist to upgrade the memory to allow 26 seconds of sample time. Although, it is possible that he, as an example, took 4 10-second samples of the record and mashed them together to make it seem like one continuous uninterrupted sample. However, this is just speculation and something that I am truthfully not well versed in. Nevertheless, to add a further taste to his song, he would sample the piano from Meredith Monk's song titled Biography. Although, we aren't done just yet. Shadow would utilize 2 more samples, another one by Meredith Monk's Dolman Music, as well as another piano sample from David Axelrod's The Human Abstract. At this point, Shadow already has a beautiful song, and without adding anything else, would still have been a hit. However, there's plenty of final touches that need to be made. As a way to match the theming of the song, he'd take a 1-second sample from McKinley's 1993 song, Out of State. This would also be used to transition another sample into the song, and is, yet again, another sample from Meredith Monk's Dolman Music. As beautiful as this is, there's one more sample from Pekka's The Madness Subsides. The amount of samples used in just this song is dumbfounding. A lot of them shouldn't work, yet they do. The fact Davis was able to utilize the limitations of the hardware and used it to his advantage is incredible. But this barely scratches the surface of Davis's sampling. There's another song that's in its own world, and it's called Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. For the first sample, he'd take a 5-second piano sample from Jeremy Storch's I Feel a New Shadow. By repeating this loop, he was able to make the motif for the song. Although, to really add to the song, he'd take 2 samples, one of which was an interview with George Marsh on the musical importance of drums.
And from listening to records, I just knew what to do. I mainly taught myself. And, I did pretty well, except there were a few mistakes that I made that I have just recently cleared up, I'd like to just continue to be able to express myself as best as I can on the instrument. I feel like I have a lot of work to do still, I'm a student of the drums. And I'm also a teacher of the drums too,
This adds a filler before transitioning into the drums, but before doing so, Shadow would once again take another 2-second sample from Jeremy Storch's song, which is a singular piano note. By grabbing these 2 samples, he'd be able to perfectly transition into the drums, which was yet again another 5-second sample, this time of being a song named Soul Food by Frankie C. and the Soul Riders. At least, that's what most people thought. In the 2012 NPR interview, he'd state,
The percussion is from a high school record. In the 60s and 70s primarily, any local high school or college would, in addition to having a yearbook, the school would pay to press 500 copies of the school band and what they were up to. That's where the drums come from.
However, during a 2016 podcast, he'd also state,
The drums to this day have never really been identified. I've seen them identified incorrectly online. But the drums come from a really unusual record, and it's a high school record, I'll just say that much.
So, while the Soul Food drums are similar to the ones used in Building Steam with a Grain of Salt, when you isolate the drums, you can hear a solid difference between the 2. But this is just the start of the samples. He'd take another 6-second sample from, yet again, Jeremy Storch's I Feel a New Shadow. This allows for a nearly perfect study song, but the beat itself, while good, can get repetitive. So, to change it up and make it feel more lively, Shadow opted to take another sample, this time being a person talking from Mort Garson in the Signs of Zodiac, titled Planetary Motivations.
What makes cancer tenacious? The moon rules the fluids, including the inner juices of human beings, that which assimilates and feeds the body. So the crab feeds his astral brain, assimilating and distributing all he receives slowly until it becomes a part of him.
Moreover, to help with the hollowness, he'd add a 9-second guitar sample from HP Riot's I Need You. As well as another 6-second sample from Lexia's I Worship You. And yet again, another 7-second sample from the same song.
I can fly to the strangest land.
This allows an arguably hollow song to become full of life. You don't get bored. Instead, you focus on what's going on in the song and the things the people are saying.
What makes cancer tenacious? The moon rules the fluids, including the inner juices of human beings.
This is why his album is nearly perfect. It allows you to use it for studying, but also allows you to drift off and think about life. This was a lot to talk about, but it gives you insight on just how beautifully constructed these songs are. To dissect each sample for every song could take hours, which showcases how creative Davis was and still is. But this isn't the end of his creativity. First, what the hell does Endtroducing mean? And lastly, how did he manage to create such an iconic album cover? Well, the name for it is surprisingly unique, yet simple. Yet again, in the interview with NPR, Davis would state, "It's interesting. Sometimes people forget that although Endtroducing is my first album, it's actually 5 years into my career of putting out records. I had put out a lot of singles on various labels, had done a lot of remixes, and had done a lot of productions for other artists, primarily MCs. The reason it's spelled END at the beginning was because I saw it as a final chapter in a number of singles that I had already done. This also helps explain why Shadow's album was initially a hit in the UK, as most of the singles and other productions he made became more known in the UK than in the US. Moreover, as a way to further extend on the album's aesthetic, he'd focus on arguably the most important part of the album, the cover. Contrary to popular belief, the cover was not a photo of some random people at a record store. Instead, it was a posed photograph taken by Shadow's friends, 2 of which are on the cover, named Chief XL, who became a part of the rap duo Blackalicious, as well as Lyrics Born, who is a part of another rap duo named Latrix. And lastly, the man behind the camera, named B+, would take the photo. The photo in itself is simple. You have 2 men shopping at a record store, which is what the album is about due to it using samples. However, despite the cover being posed, this photo was a mistake. During the photo shoot, a total of 5 would be taken, one with Chief XL facing away while looking through records, probably to be used as a front cover, as well as another of Lyrics Born next to him, probably to be used as a back cover. Similar to both of these, B+ would take another photo of them together. As for the other 2, a wide-angle shot would be used of both subjects looking through records opposite of each other, which also included the store's cat named Neferkitty, as well as Shadow's friend, Benny B. Although, Brian Cross was not a fan of the photograph at the time, which is greatly shown through a quote of his. "We measured the focus really quickly because of the cat, and we measured in feet when it's set for meters. It was honestly a total mistake." This explains why most of the photo isn't in focus. Though, it wasn't the only mistake in the photo. Due to the slower shutter speed Cross used, he managed to capture the photo the exact moment Lyrics Born was moving his head, which caused his facial features to be blurred out. As a result of this, Brian would take another photo that, this time, was in focus and would not have Lyrics Born's face be blurry. Although, despite having 4 nearly perfect photos, Shadow opted to use a one with the mistakes. By using some slight color grading in post, such as giving it higher contrast, as well as a greenish hue, it allows a cover to have a lonely, nightish vibe. And lastly, the lack of facial features from both men makes it appear distant and mysterious. While the photo may seem simple, artistically speaking, it's not. Despite mistakes being made, to have a cover that matches the tone the album gives off is incredibly difficult. Either it can turn into a pile of meaningless colors, or it can turn into one of the most beautifully iconic pieces ever created. It's been nearly 30 years since Endtroducing was released. While there has been albums and records that are similar to it since its release, there's no denying that Endtroducing is a timeless classic. Not only did it help the art of sampling become more known, but it also, in a way, revolutionized how instrumental albums were made. To use tens of samples for an instrumental was rare, and there are still samples to be found nearly 3 decades after its creation. It's a masterpiece that keeps giving, no matter how old it is.